Well, good morning. My name is Mary FioRito, and I am the Cardinal Francis George Fellow here at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. And if you are looking for wing-to-wing, oar-to-oar, room 162, you are in the right session. I had a bet with my friend Judge Tom Donnelly, who is over in 161, that I would have more people in my room, so thank you. Both of us are under this illusion that somehow you're here because of us. But anyway, thank you. I think I win. I'm going to snap a picture to show them. This I think is going to be a particularly fascinating panel, as anything to do with husband and wife and marriages normally is. So I don't want to take up too much time with our introductions. Kathy Deavel from the University of St. Thomas, who mentioned to me that the most important thing in her biography is the fact that she has 7 children and does all of this amazing academic work while juggling all of those things to do with marriage and family. So we're going to start with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Kathy.
Thank you for coming, and I hope that you will be delighted to find out that this will be the only full philosophy slide in this entire presentation. So let's see what we can do. I want to very briefly talk about conditions for friendship, then the criteria used by the characters, and then I want to talk about the characters in Pride and Prejudice. So here we go. Criteria for all friendships according to Aristotle. And Aristotle, as you probably noticed through this conference, gets talked about a lot when it comes to friendship. Friends share mutual affection recognized by each friend. So you can't be an anonymous secret friend, right? They have to know you're there, and there has to be mutual affection. All friendship has as its object something good or pleasant, either absolutely or relatively to the person who feels the affection, and this is based on some similarity between the parties. Okay, that, in the ideal case, would be the person's virtue. Not always, of course, we'll see that in a minute, but each friend, because of this basis of the friendship, will wish the other's good with respect to that quality for which you love that friend. So if the person is pleasant to you, you love the person for the qualities that make them pleasant. If they're useful to you, the qualities that make the person useful. If you think the person is a good person, a person of virtue and character, an excellent individual, then you love that person for that person's virtue and character. The friendship will dissolve when the ground of friendship is gone. Good news, virtue doesn't dissolve easily, if ever. So the most stable friendships, as we'll see, are those based on goodness. Continuing, as opposed to a friendship based on pleasure or utility, in a true or goodness friendship, friends are valued for their own sake, for their goodness of character. So here's Aristotle. Only the friendship of those who are good and similar in their goodness is perfect. Those who desire the good of their friends for the friend's sake are most truly friends, because each loves the other for what he is and not for any incidental quality. Goodness friendships encompass the goods of the other 2 kinds. So morally good people are both pleasant and useful to one another. Because moral goodness is relatively stable and permanent, perfect friendships are correspondingly permanent, and the friend is a second self. By the time you hit folks like Thomas and later descriptions, we're told that love is to will the good of the other. And in the case of a perfect friendship, the other person can be a second self, such that I wish the other person's good as, in some sense, part of my own good, and I could wish for the good of the other and sacrifice for the good of the other because I wish that person's good for that person's own sake. Which takes us to Pride and Prejudice. I want you to keep goodness friendship in mind, but these are the things that the people in Pride and Prejudice actually discuss when they start talking about their criteria for marriage. The first, the ever-present prudential problem. You should choose someone who has enough money and or a comfortable home or living. To not do this would be unwise for both of you. Second concern is connections and obligations to family. Those are somewhat connected, obviously. So you want a family of roughly the same standing as yours, but there's also this notion of obligations to family. So I'm going to do you either the disservice or the credit of assuming that you know Pride and Prejudice well and just start talking about people you don't know. So the oldest sister, Jane, when she becomes engaged to Bingley, is profoundly joyful and happy. But one of the things she's happy about is that she has done well by her family, right? That she's in love with him, this is wonderful, but also that it's a good for her family. right? So these aren't simply minor or secondary kinds of concerns, sort of outside the pale. The third one is good manners. We'll be coming back to that. How do you present yourself? How do you care for the feelings of the people around you? Are you aloof, possibly dismissive? Those would be bad things. The fourth and the fifth are of particular interest: character and understanding that merit esteem and respect. That's going to be our touchstone, and given what we've said about goodness friendship, for understandable reason. The fifth, however, affection and attachment. I love that Austen uses the term attachment. So when you're smitten with someone, you have formed an attachment, right? You wish to be with this person. I'll just leave that there. So criteria 3 through 5 seem most central to the friendship and marriage sought by the central characters in Pride and Prejudice, particularly our two favorites, Elizabeth and Darcy. I'm going to talk as though I have these two categories. These aren't real categories out there. You'll never hear them outside this talk. So don't worry that you haven't heard them. I'm going to talk about friendship minimalists and friendship maximalists. So my friendship minimalists are people like Wickham, our cad of the novel. Lydia. So Lydia is a minimalist when it comes to friendship. She's much more interested in uniforms and fun and these sorts of things. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a minimalist. The most important thing is connections, right? However, we have one, how do I put this? One noble minimalist, if I can put it that way, Charlotte. Charlotte is Elizabeth's best friend, although we'll see that that friendship is somewhat marred by Charlotte's choice of a husband. Charlotte's primary focus is prudential, and she is very clear-eyed in her decision. She doesn't try to sugarcoat it to herself or to Elizabeth. She respects Elizabeth's understanding too much for that. So here we have Charlotte, and I'll note that this quote comes after she's announced to Elizabeth that she's going to marry Mr. Collins, after Elizabeth has refused him outright and couldn't imagine a reasonable woman accepting him. When Charlotte tells Elizabeth she's going to marry Collins, her first response is, impossible. Not exactly the reception a friend might wish to this announcement. Elizabeth recovers herself, but this is within that conversation. So Charlotte says, I am not romantic, you know, I never was. I ask only for a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state. Again, this, I won't read all of them, but she's already told us, or at least the narrator is telling us in sort of Charlotte's perspective, she finds his company irksome. She knows he's a man of no sense. However, she does know that he is a man of position. He has some character. She doesn't expect that he's going to be unfaithful, right? And he can provide her with what she hopes for. Elizabeth's assessment to Darcy later on, so once we're in the rosing circle, Darcy comments that Mr. Collins has been very fortunate in his wife. And Elizabeth does respond. Mr. Collins's friends may rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him. Or, notice that this is a second point, or have made him happy if they had. My friend has an excellent understanding, though I am not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and again, in a prudential light. In a prudential light, it is certainly a very good match for her. So in some sense, Elizabeth is giving Charlotte's criterion its due. If that really is her criterion, she has done well. This passage, however, has to be taken in the context of a couple things. First, I'm talking about courtship and marriage, but please note that the criteria, I should say, for a goodness friendship apply across Darcy and Elizabeth's friendships. After Charlotte has made her announcement she's going to marry Mr. Collins, we have some rather painful passages. Elizabeth says she doesn't think that they can be friends as they once were, right? She doesn't think that they can have the confidence that they once were. She sees Charlotte as disgracing herself and putting herself into a situation in which she cannot be happy. And Elizabeth mourns that her friend would do such a thing, and her friend falls in her esteem. They are not going to be as close as they once were, right? This passage is also followed as the party is leaving the circle of rosings with the narrator, but in some sense from Elizabeth's point of view, saying that Charlotte had seemed happy, right? Charlotte gave the run of the house and has made sure that Mr. Collins finds diversion elsewhere for most of the day and seems relatively happy. As they're leaving, she's a little worried about Charlotte, but she notes that Charlotte is pleased with the duties that she has in the parish and the different things that she does within her own home. However, the comment is that these things have not yet lost their charm. Elizabeth is still worried that Charlotte is in for decades of a marriage that can't actually suit her character and understanding. Okay, so she gives due to the criterion, but she hasn't yet been persuaded that it was a reasonable choice on Charlotte's part. Okay. Oh, Mr. Collins, yes. So we have the anatomy of a disastrous proposal. So as you recall, Mr. Collins arrives and he has decided to take a wife, and when he gives his proposal, I'd like to give him full points, though, that he starts out with a major premise, something along the lines of, marriage is a great idea. You're someone I could marry. Marrying you would be a great idea, seems to be the conclusion. But this is how he actually goes about it. He begins with his reasons for marrying. Not marrying her, but marrying. And the reasons are to set an example of matrimony in the parish. He is, after all, minister in charge of this parish. It will add to his happiness. Okay, that would be reasonable. If it didn't add to his happiness, one should cease and desist. The third, which he probably should have mentioned earlier, is that he's doing so on the advice of his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who advises it, which of course should come first in his own mind and that of his wife, given her consequence. That out of the way, he proceeds with reasons for choosing among the Miss Bennets. Please notice that Elizabeth is still not quite within view here. So because he's going to inherit the father's estate, it's on his conscience that there have not been good relations entirely among the families, and that if he's going to inherit the estate, he would like to not take it from the family entirely. So he should marry a Bennet. And she's a Bennet, so here we go. He ends with a profession of affection. Now nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. And he immediately goes on to explain that he's unconcerned with her lack of fortune. So please note a couple of things. There's the lovely comedic effect of telling her that he should be assuring her in the most animated language of the violence of his affection, not actually doing so, and then moving on to explain that the money isn't really a big deal and she shouldn't feel as though she's coming to the marriage with a shadow over her. Okay, a couple of things. Clearly, connections are what he's interested in, right? He wants to do what's considered respectable. He wants to fulfill what he's being asked by his patroness. He's not as concerned with the prudential part. Why? Because he's set up, right? In Charlotte's case, she's not going to be set. The prudential is a big concern for her. So she considers matrimony not necessarily a huge good on its own, but it's a lot better than her other alternatives, right? So for Mr. Collins, he considers marrying to be more or less part of what he needs to do to maintain the position he has. It's to be expected. It's probably a good thing. So he's going to choose. He had hoped Jane, but Lizzie will do, right? Okay, do note that he wants to think of marriage in a way that his understanding doesn't quite match with. There's a lovely passage later where he's talking about his marriage to Charlotte. So Elizabeth has been visiting with other folks at the married Collinses' home, and it's clear to her that Mrs. Collins is making the best of it and doing well and understands the situation. It is, however, Mr. Collins's claim that his bond to Charlotte is a bond of true friendship. We have but one mind. It is as though we were designed for each other. And he does seem to have an affection for his wife, but it doesn't seem to be based on any particularly deep insight into the reality of the situation. Okay, so it's not as though he ignores the other criteria, it's just he doesn't really have the mental acuity to make judgments that would allow us to say that we've met these things. Okay, we are gonna move. So Darcy is attentive to character. I'm gonna skip through quotes, but he's also attentive to connections. Anatomy of another disastrous proposal. He actually goes with the reverse. It's a switching of the Collins approach. He begins with a profession of affection. He proceeds to reflections on the inferiority of her family with equal warmth, and then he adds with absolute confidence of a favorable answer. Please notice that given his position, affection plays a greater role. Indeed, when he first is encountering Elizabeth, we're told that he's bewitched by her as he's never been bewitched by another woman, and he wants to make sure that she doesn't see it, and he gives no encouragement, because it would be wrong of him to encourage such a situation, since she's inferior and marriage is not an option. Here we hit a poignant kind of consideration. I won't read the quote in its entirety, but Elizabeth recognizes that her father married a lovely woman who did not have the sense, the understanding that he thought she had. This has proven disastrous for Mr. Bennet. He's born with it. He hasn't been unfaithful. He's merely retreated to country pursuits in his library. But notice that this has repercussions on himself and his family. He has not taken his daughters in hand. This is directly before Lydia's heading off with the soldiers, and we know what's going to happen. She's going to run off with Wickham. And Elizabeth, now knowing about Wickham's character, is utterly apprehensive. Because of the unsuitable match, she sees that her father has never been happy. And her mother has been constantly held up in her weaknesses before the daughters. She recognizes that as a huge impropriety. So it's bad for the couple, it's bad for the family. Notice when she rejects Collins, she says, "You could not make me happy, and I am convinced I am the last woman in the world who could make you so." That's not a put down. That comes from her experience. If we were to marry, I would be desperately unhappy, and it looks like I would make you unhappy too. For Elizabeth, esteem and understanding serve as the primary basis for affection in her friendships in general. We saw that with Charlotte. Note that manners are the reason for the motive for rejection of Mr. Darcy. She tells him that he has been insufferable, conceited, and so she's not sorry for her impoliteness in rejecting him. And it's the change in his manners. The word manners is mentioned multiple times in the encounter at Pemberley. But notice this too, and again, I won't read through. Once he has changed his manners, Charlotte is sure that she doesn't want to encourage the thought that Mr. Darcy could be in love with Elizabeth, because if dislike of Mr. Darcy were to be alleviated, of course Elizabeth would marry Mr. Darcy. I want you to note that that works much better in Hallmark specials than it does in Pride and Prejudice. At this point, she does esteem him, and she is grateful for a love that would make him forgive, and it's gratitude, right? She says gratitude is the major thing she's feeling for Mr. Darcy, that he would overlook her mistaken judgments, right? Her attempt to bait him on multiple occasions, her impoliteness in rejecting him, all of this has been forgiven. But here's the thing, he's a man of money, prudential, connections is good, his manners have now changed, she has esteem and respect for him. Fifth criterion is the only thing we have left. But she doesn't know if she has affection for him. And until she knows that, which she knows the minute the letter about Lydia leaving with Mr. Wickham comes, she doesn't know whether she should encourage it. Her aunt and uncle say that they're very clear that the gentleman is in love, but they don't know their niece's opinion. They don't know what she's feeling, which is reasonable because she doesn't know what she's feeling. Esteem and respect are the basis, but not the entirety of what she needs. Okay, we're going to run this. So how do you increase in virtue? This is presumably the good that you want. If there is a goodness friendship, both of you need to be increasing in virtue to build that basis through fraternal correction, which obviously gets off to kind of a rocky start for Elizabeth and Darcy. Don't do fraternal correction in anger. Bad idea. Okay. Spurring self-knowledge and then motivating greater virtue. And notice again that the effects extend beyond the couple. Elizabeth's prejudice is overcome. The key scene is after she reads the letter from Darcy. She's mortified. She had driven out reason and judgment. Till this moment, I never knew myself. She had thought herself a very good judge and is utterly mortified. And Darcy's pride at the very end. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. By you, I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception, which was obvious at the time. And you shewed me, which sounds better in British, me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. He did not recognize that his pride was a problem. Remember in the earlier scenes, he said if pride has a proper basis, then it's fine. Okay, I will be extending beyond the family part. At the very end of Pride and Prejudice, we don't end with the wedding, right? We go on past that to the effect on the family. Lydia and Wickham are sent money, generally covertly, by Elizabeth. They impose themselves on Jane and Bingley. It's also the case, though, that Kitty comes to stay with her sisters and is improved. Mary gets more attention from Mom. You can take that either way, but things are generally better for her, right? And Georgiana, Darcy's younger sister, gets to see how a married couple acts versus a brother and a sister. No one pokes fun at Mr. Darcy, but there's a levity there that she hadn't realized was possible. I do want to note this, though. Here's my last quote. When Mr. Bennet is trying to encourage Elizabeth not to accept Mr. Darcy, I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. You know not what you are about. Okay, given what we know about his own marriage, there's an urgency about this. Do not marry for connections. Do not marry for the money. If you esteem him, but also have affection for him, then this might be reasonable. I do want to comment on the rather uncontemporary suggestion that your spouse should be superior to you. Please note that if what you want to do is grow in virtue, does it make much sense to choose someone who's barely your equal or lower than you are in virtue? So please let's not get too hung up on that word. Presumably, we want to grow in virtue, and we want a helpmate who will push us to move in that direction, partially by his or her own virtue. Hence, I end. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I could have heard you go on for another 20 minutes of, no. I think it's a favorite novel of so many people for so many reasons. And for those who would like to see Dr. Deavel's other work or are interested in her other work, she has published on topics as varied as Plato's Republic, Thomas Aquinas on friendship, and the Harry Potter series. So there you go. Our next speaker is Scott Hefelfinger, who's the assistant professor of theology at the Augustine Institute in Denver. He has a PhD in moral theology from the University of Notre Dame here, and as well as an STL in systematic theology from the International Theological Institute in Austria. His interests include also Aquinas, Catholic social teaching, spiritual theology, and the place of human beings in the natural world within the web of technology that surrounds us. Maybe dating apps will come up on this one, I'm not sure. He lives in Centennial, Colorado with his wife and his 3 children. Dr. Hefelfinger.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to those who've organized the conference and for all of you for being here. It's really a delight to be able to share these thoughts. Thanks to my fellow presenters here. It was a fantastic presentation, and I look forward to Pia's as well. The title of my talk is The Virtue of Husband and Wife, Understanding Marital Friendship in Aquinas with a Little Help from Homer. Thomas Aquinas is well known for drawing on Aristotle's analysis of friendship in order to understand and to define charity. Less familiar is Aquinas' approach to marriage in terms of friendship. Marriage, writes Aquinas, is the greatest friendship. And he elaborates this elsewhere by means of Aristotle's threefold division of friendship, which we just saw before. Friendship of utility, of pleasure, and of virtue. Now, this already contains a great richness to be explored, but Aquinas goes further, adding suggestively, quote, there is a virtue proper to both husband and wife that renders their friendship delightful. But what exactly is this virtue, and how does it relate to the 3 kinds of friendship? The angelic doctor does not say. Whatever this virtue is, we seem to stand in great need of it. The world today seems a stranger to the delight that Aquinas mentions, and is instead overly familiar with serial cohabitation, broken homes, and more recently, what has been termed sexless marriages, which result in no small part from the proliferation of pornography. Given so much sadness, discontentment, restlessness, and even despair in the arena of marriage, I was struck all the more powerfully by Aquinas' pregnant and provocative remark. And so this short paper is just my attempt to tease out its meaning. To do this, I'll draw on the theory of Aristotle and the poetry of Homer to put meat on the bones of Aquinas' skeletal remark, namely that there is a virtue proper to spouses. So in a first step, I'll argue based on Aristotle and Aquinas that there is an excellence specific to the coordinated and cooperative work of the household. In a second step, I'll turn to Homer's Odyssey, where I propose we catch a glimpse of what this mutual work looks like, and in particular, the kind of friendship between equals that it entails. Taken all together, Aquinas, Aristotle, and Homer offer resources for a renewed vision of marriage that I think is strikingly relevant in a world longing for delight and pining for a renewal of culture, a renewal that begins with the friendship and virtue of husband and wife. So the first step is Aristotle and Aquinas. When in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas speaks of marriage as, quote, the greatest friendship, he offers two reasons, which at first glance can seem a little thin. He holds that husband and wife are, quote, united not only in the act of fleshly union, which produces a certain gentle association, even among beasts, but also in the partnership of the whole range of domestic activity. It can almost sound like Aquinas is suggesting that what makes the greatest friendship between husband and wife is that they sleep in the same bed at night and then make the bed together in the morning. Understandably, we're left wanting a little more than that. If we turn to his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, it helps us to appreciate that, as we expect, there is more going on here. The friendship between husband and wife is a complex, multifaceted reality. One facet is its usefulness. It's a friendship of utility, Aquinas points out, since it, quote, furnishes a sufficiency of things for family life, end quote. Another facet of this friendship is that it is pleasant or pleasurable. Thus, it is a friendship of pleasure, seen most clearly, but by no means exclusively, in marital intimacy. The last facet is that related to virtue. Aquinas holds that marital friendship can also be based on virtue, and thus it can reach the level of a noble or virtuous friendship. What is a virtuous friendship for Aristotle and Aquinas? Friendships are based on love, and thus the precise object of love will determine the sort of friendship. Because friendships of utility and of pleasure are based on a love that targets some good other than a person, Aristotle sees them as incomplete or incidental. Complete friendship, in contrast, includes the dimensions of utility and pleasure, but also goes beyond them. This central case of friendship is found in virtuous friendships, which are based on a love for the person and his or her goodness or virtue. It is a relation of reciprocal and recognized affection between two people who know each other and enjoy the virtue of the other. The hallmark of this kind of noble friendship is that the friends simply enjoy living in each other's company, as Aristotle puts it. They reciprocally share in thought and perception, so that each becomes to the other an other self, for whom the good is willed for his or her own sake. Thus, it is easy to see the potential for spouses to become such friends, living and sharing in so much of life together. At the same time, it's no less easy to see the challenges that present themselves here as well. So marriage can have all three of these facets, and it is right after mentioning that marital friendship can be a virtuous friendship that Aquinas writes the puzzling formulation cited above. There is a virtue proper to both husband and wife that renders their friendship delightful to each other. I think it's easy to pass over this statement too quickly and assume it simply restates something already covered in the immediately preceding discussion of the three types of friendship. For example, the word delightful might call to mind that marriage is a friendship of pleasure, and we could leave it at that. More likely, perhaps, the word virtue puts our minds in the context of a friendship of virtue, and thus we might tend simply to read this statement in a very general way to hold that husbands and wives must have the virtues, especially the moral virtues, in order to take delight in each other, in their mutual friendship. This is no doubt true, but it isn't the specific point that Aquinas is making here. We know this because he doesn't speak of virtue in general, but that virtue proper to both husband and wife. Much earlier in the Nicomachean Ethics, back in Book 2, when Aristotle begins to consider what virtue is, he addresses the kind of virtue that Aquinas seems to have in mind. Virtue understood more as an excellence than as a particular moral virtue. Aristotle writes, quote, "Every virtue causes that of which it is the virtue to be in a good state and to perform its characteristic activity well," end quote. This kind of excellence prepares or disposes the capacities of an agent so that it is ready to carry out a specific kind of activity and to do this well. This line of thought is taken up again later in Book 8 in Aristotle's discussion of marriage and life in the household. In this domain, he considers different types of relationships within the household and states very generally that, quote, "The virtue of each of these is different, their characteristic activity is different, and so are the reasons for their becoming friends," end quote. This phrase is so compact that it's easy to miss that Aristotle is actually tracing in reverse order the genesis and development of friendship. The reason for becoming friends is a common good. The characteristic activity is that one performed cooperatively in order to attain this common good. And the virtue is that disposition that renders the activity consistent, effective, and delightful. Thus, we see that these three dimensions of becoming friends are closely linked: the reason for friendship, the activity of friendship, and the virtue that enables this activity to be excellent and delightful. With these fundamental dimensions in mind, we see that in order to trace the contours of the virtue proper to both husband and wife, we have to understand more about the reason for this particular friendship and its characteristic activity. The reason for a friendship is a common good, and thus we should expect to find such a shared good at the basis of marital friendship, and indeed Aristotle offers two: the child and a sufficiency of things for daily life. He writes, quote, "Children are a good common to both spouses," end quote. But, quote, "human beings live together not only for reproductive purposes, but also to supply what they need for daily life," end quote. The characteristic activity of this friendship by which these common goods are attained is that broad set of activities that are performed in the service of the child in the household. Aquinas expresses both of these dimensions nicely when, in the earlier quotation from the Summa Contra Gentiles, he said that they are united in conjugal intercourse and in a partnership of the whole range of domestic activity. Finally, this leads us to the disposition that enables this activity to be carried out effectively, consistently, and delightfully. There is an habitual excellence that perfects the cooperative rearing of children and managing a household. So with that, we've made some strides beyond the possible initial impression of the marital bed as merely a locus of pleasurable and useful friendship, but the idea still remains a little thin. What does this partnership look like, we wonder, and what does it entail? So it's at this point that I find it helpful to turn to Homer, and this is our second step. If Aristotle and Aquinas inform our intellects with their careful reasoning, it is Homer who can better shape our imagination when it comes to envisioning this partnership. Of course, it's a challenge to say just a few words on Homer's masterpiece, the Odyssey, and even though I'll limit myself to the friendship between Odysseus and Penelope, this challenge is heightened by the fact that Homer prepares us in so many ways throughout the epic to understand this friendship before we see them actually reunited in it. So I'll simply reflect on two moments in the poem that I think begin to reveal the shape and scope of marital friendship. The first is around the middle of the epic, when Odysseus is washed onto the shore of the land of the Phaeacians. Waterlogged and exhausted, he takes refuge for the night under leaves beneath a bush. But this is not just any bush, it's an olive bush. And given the important place of a certain olive tree later in the tale, this is significant. It is all the more significant that this olive bush is actually two in one. Homer writes, "Two bushy olives sprung from the same root, one olive wild, the other well-bred stock. No sodden gusty winds could ever pierce them, nor could the sun's sharp rays invade their depths, nor could a downpour drench them through and through. So dense they grew together, tangling side by side. Seen within the whole of the Odyssey, this image conjures up marriage. And this theme is still on the mind when, upon waking the next day, Odysseus encounters the stunningly beautiful princess Nausicaa, whose mind is filled with, quote, hopes for marriage. And thus she has come with her maidens to wash her fine clothes in preparation for the time of marriage. In the course of their masterfully crafted conversation, Odysseus wishes her the greatest of goods. Quote, may the good gods give you all your heart desires, husband and house and lasting harmony too. No finer, greater gift in the world than that, when man and woman possess their home, two minds, two hearts that work as one. Despair to their enemies, a joy to all their friends, their own best claim to glory. End quote. The key phrase here is when man and woman possess their home, two minds, two hearts that work as one. Odysseus speaks from experience, and that experience is the friendship he seeks above all others, his with his wife Penelope. They are partners, equals in the project of managing a well-ordered household, which begins with rearing their child together, includes the domestic work in the home, and extends to ruling a well-ordered kingdom, Ithaca. It is this partnership of two minds, two hearts working as one in the home that lies at the heart of the tale of homecoming that is the Odyssey. But one of the remarkable aspects of the epic is that we scarcely get to see the outer workings of this partnership, except in indirect ways. In hints that are given, in other conversations or examples that are presented as positive comparisons or negative contrasts. But even if we don't see very much of the outer workings, we do catch a glimpse of the inner workings. This leads to the second moment I'll consider, Odysseus' return to Ithaca. When Odysseus finally returns to his home, he conspires with the goddess Athena to retake his house and his kingdom, but under the guise of a beggar rather than as a king. The wily and crafty Odysseus weaves a plan that will enable him to test the members of his household, including Penelope, before retaking his well-timbered house. But he is not the only tactician on Ithaca. Beyond Athena, his divine conspirator and counterpart, Odysseus has a human conspirator and counterpart as well, his wife, Penelope. She herself tells Odysseus about, quote, weaving a plan, this time involving literal weaving, to bide her time before the ill-suited suitors. By weaving and unweaving Laertes' funeral shroud, Penelope reveals that she is Odysseus' partner and equal in devising strategies. There is another way that we see the partnership play out between them. Through his many wanderings, Odysseus has in his mind and on his heart the good of his household, and to support this good economically, he comes home to Ithaca bearing many treasures, gifts from the Phaeacians. Penelope, for her part, has in the meantime cleverly managed to win gifts from her suitors by taking advantage of their wooing and leading them on by indicating her desire for gifts. She too has the household in mind, especially as it bleeds meat and wine to support the horde of suitors in its halls. Lastly, Odysseus is not the only one doing the testing. Penelope too devises some tests, the culmination of which is the test of the bed. Odysseus himself had crafted their marital bed out of a large old olive tree, which remained rooted in the ground and around which their bedchamber was built. Well aware of the fixed, rooted marital bed, and knowing that this is one of their secret signs, Penelope suggests to her maid that it be brought out of their bedroom for Odysseus to sleep in that first night back. Aware that there may still be trickery about, patient and clever Penelope indicates that she needs a little time before a complete reunion can occur. Odysseus is furious that his fixed bed has apparently been uprooted, and with this fury, he passes Penelope's test with flying colors. She falls into his welcome arms, and reunited in this embrace, Homer crafts one of his amazing and remarkably telling similes. Quote, he wept as he held the wife he loved, the soul of loyalty, in his arms at last. As welcome as appears the land to swimmers, whose well-built ship Poseidon has broken up on the sea, driven by the wind and the robust wave, and a few escape, swimming from the gray sea to dry land, their bodies encrusted with salt, and with a sense of welcome they plant their feet on solid ground again, spared a deadly fate. So welcome was her husband to her as she gazed at him, and for a long time she did not let go her white arms from around his neck. End quote. In the midst of this beautiful but lengthy simile, it's easy to lose track that Odysseus is the welcome land and Penelope is the one shipwrecked, hated by Poseidon, escaping, swimming, struggling, suffering. In other words, she is Odysseus. This husband and wife pair are to each other truly other selves, like one soul in two bodies. In each of these three brief examples, and many more could be given, Penelope is presented as Odysseus' equal, his partner, his counterpart. She is, according to a metaphor that Odysseus himself applies to her, the kingly queen. And in these examples, we see that even in their separation and even before their official reunion, they are partners, sharing in the work of preserving and restoring their house and, by extension, their kingdom. These moments reveal the inner workings of their union of mind and heart, of their partnership in the whole range of domestic activities. So, in conclusion, with the marital friendship of Odysseus and Penelope in mind, we return to our opening question about the virtue proper to spouses that Aquinas mentioned in passing. What is this virtue? At this point, it will certainly come as a disappointment that I don't think it has a precise name. Aristotle admits of various virtues and vices that remain basically nameless. But if I had to give it a name, as Aristotle tries to do for those otherwise nameless states, I might follow Homer and call it like-mindedness in the household. This description reflects the sharing in experience and perception between equal partners in the project of domestic life. It doesn't imply constant agreement, nor does it rule out challenging or refining, but it does suggest regular conversation and constant cooperation. Or I might simply call this virtue household management, though this has to be understood in a very wide sense that includes procreation, education, and fostering life, love, and culture in the home. Wendell Berry helpfully describes this kind of household and the kind of virtue that enables its excellent activity in a way that I appreciate. Quote, "The household is the bond of marriage that is most native to it, that grows with it and gives it substantial being in the world. It is the practical condition within which husband and wife can enact devotion and loyalty to each other. The motive power of sexual love is thus joined directly to constructive work and is given communal and ecological value. Without the particular demands and satisfactions of the making and keeping of a household, the sanctity and legality of marriage remain abstract, in effect, theoretical, and its sexuality becomes a danger. Work is the health of love. To last, love must enflesh itself in the materiality of the world, produce food, shelter, warmth, or shade, surround itself with careful acts, well-made things." End quote. Work is the health of love. I'm tempted to go even further and say that cooperative work is the very life of love, provided we understand that this work includes a leisurely dimension as well. It is the life of love because the love that is marital friendship is a love generated and sustained by a commitment to work towards the common good that is the solid foundation and ever-strengthening force of the friendship. That is, the common good of establishing, as Pope John Paul II says, a communion of life and love. This common work and the attainment of its common goal is a delight, one of the highest in this life, precisely because both the work and the goal are good, and to have them a great delight. Not every moment will be a delight in every respect, and indeed some moments may seem a delight in no respect, and yet the friendship of its activity will ultimately bring delight and renew delight to spouses who possess that virtue proper to both husband and wife. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. And we will be taking questions at the end. And I imagine that you're all eager to expand on some of these remarks. Our final speaker will be Dr. Pid Cellini, who I'm proud to say has been my friend for 25 years. When did we start preschool? What year was that? That was Dr. Cellini, for those of you who don't know her, is a theologian and an ethicist and a cultural analyst. Her most recent work involved being the chancellor of the Diocese of Orange, and she was also the theological advisor to the bishop. You've probably seen her work. It's been widely published in everything from the Wall Street Journal Europe to the Washington Post to multiple Catholic publications. She's also done extensive radio and television work. Pia received her doctorate in sacred theology summa cum laude from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. And kind of the coolest thing about this is in 2001, she was awarded the award of the Pontifical Academies for her doctoral dissertation, and that award was personally presented to her by St. John Paul II. So Pia's like a second-class relic, like, because they touched her. So Dr. Pia Di Solenni, talk about not putting the pressure on. Our second-class relic, Dr. Pia Di Solenni.
Thank you, Mary. Actually, it was about 15 years ago, and we had lunch in Chicago, and I remember where it was.
Because I wasn't married yet.
Yes, you were.
I wasn't.
I would have been in Rome 25 years ago, so
Okay, all
yeah.
right.
You were both in elementary school.
That's right.
That's right,
I
kindergarten.
remember.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you all. On a personal note, it's kind of fun for me. I'm grateful to both of my co-panelists because tomorrow is my husband's and I's 13th anniversary. So I'm headed home tonight so that I won't be flying tomorrow. And I can think of better things to do than spend an anniversary in an airport. So the title of my talk today is Equality of Difference, Leading to a Most Profound Intimacy and Friendship. I want to start with the concept of difference. For many reasons, we struggle with the concept of difference, particularly difference amongst human persons. If someone is different, indeed, if we ourselves are different, we are quick to make a judgment, sometimes without even wondering why. We are also quick to conform, as most easily noted in fashion trends. Somewhat ironically, trendsetters make great efforts to set themselves apart, knowing full well that their talent will lead others to emulate them, thus eliminating the differences. This is not, excuse me. Despite our preconceptions, such trends are equal opportunity for both sexes. It's only recently, with millennials driving the trend, that professional men have broken out of the light blue Oxford shirt and khaki pants so-called business casual look to be replaced by new trends. This week, the Wall Street Journal published an article on the new lengths, no pun intended, that men will go in order to grow a better beard. When we experience difference, we're quick to assume some type of otherness. In some circumstances, the otherness could be desirable. For example, a unique person that one desires as a spouse, a one-of-a-kind jewel, a beautiful work of art, a rare talent, and so on. Generally, though, I would argue that differences tend to lead us to see otherness in persons in a negative light. Racism and various forms of political thought come to mind. We see in these examples the negative implications of seeing otherness as something undesirable. And perhaps one of the most cliché understandings of otherness can be found in the differences between women and men, particularly those in the married state. There are countless variations of the ball and chain jokes. The women are from Venus, men are from Mars genre. I recently heard men are waffles, women are spaghetti. Every culture has them, indicating that it's a common human experience. But since we use humor to explore them, it is also my hope that we don't take ourselves too seriously all of the time. Yet looking at the discord that exists between the sexes, in and out of marriage, we know that we do. I would offer that the precise challenge lies in understanding difference constructively. St. John Paul II offered an important distinction, noting that the differences between women and men existed before the fall. Therefore, they should be constructive. We were created to live together. God created woman and man, both in his image and likeness, giving them a shared work to do together. All of this was done before the fall. The difference the saint maintains are not the problem. Rather, the tensions that arise because of original sin, creating the battle of the sexes that we now experience. Now, despite being in the Garden of Eden, what we generally understand to have been a paradise of sorts, there came to be unrest between Adam and Eve, made evident by the serpent, who convinces them to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. In other words, despite the perfection of their surroundings and existence, despite the habit of walking with God, they were open to breaking the one condition that was required to maintain this perfection. Biblical scholar Scott Hahn highlights the complexity of this scenario. The English translation uses the word serpent, as do many other languages, which doesn't match the actual seriousness conveyed in the original Hebrew text. Tracing several scriptural references, it is clear that the serpent is in fact Satan in the form of a deadly dragon. In other words, this was not a garden variety snake or even the cobra that your college friends kept in their bathroom. Hahn writes, Adam faced a life-threatening force. And yet the text of Genesis is almost blasé. Adam's wife Eve, the flesh of his flesh, the bone of his bone, is talking with this deadly force, but there's no indication that Adam is even mildly concerned. When God confronts them after their transgression, Eve owns that she did as the serpent suggested. He tempted her, she ate of the fruit. Adam, however, passes the blame onto Eve, saying, "The woman whom you put here with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, so I ate it." Even in blaming Eve, Adam first blames God, "The woman whom you put here with me." I have to wonder if things in paradise were amiss before the serpent showed up. One need not be a perfect husband to know that one's wife is probably not in a safe space if she's conversing with a veritable monster. Nevertheless, that is a definitive point at which we see the consensual rupture of the relationship between God and his first human creatures. The original unity of man and woman now needs restoring. Thus, the narrative of salvation history continues. The Old Testament details God's relationship with his people to try and restore them to that original state, even preparing them for a better state as fulfilled in the New Testament with the incarnation and death of his only Son. With this in mind, I'd like to propose that we enter into a brief conversation of the relationship that should exist in spite of the differences, or perhaps precisely because of the differences. Before looking at Aquinas, I should like to look first at Aristotle, a non-Christian philosopher who was able to articulate the nature about truths in our world in such a way that they are not dependent on time and culture. In fact, an example of this is his treatment of women. On the one hand, he is insistent that woman is mas occasionata, the misbegotten male. In other words, because he attributed generative power solely to the male, he considered a resulting female child to be imperfect because she lacked what would make her a male. Yet in his discourses on friendship, he is clear that women can be virtuous and can exist in friendships of virtue with men. Now, in the works of Aristotle, the friendship of virtue is typically ascribed to the friendship between two men, because the contemplative life was an important aspect of the virtuous life in Aristotle's account of human flourishing. And the contemplative life was directly related to the intellectual life. Most women did not pursue the intellectual life, and hence could not have this friendship of virtue in Aristotle's account of human perfection. On the other hand, most men did not reach this level of formation either. It was a friendship which was reserved for the intellectually or philosophically elite. Yet Aristotle allows for degrees of friendship in marriage, including even the highest. In the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, he teaches, "Between man and wife, friendship seems to exist by nature. With the other animals, the union extends only to this point, namely reproduction. But human beings live together not only for the sake of reproduction, but also for the various purposes of life. For from the start, the functions are divided, and those of men and women are different. So they help each other by throwing their peculiar gifts into the common stock. It is for these reasons that both utility and pleasure seem to be bound in this kind of friendship. But this friendship may also be based on virtue if the parties are good. For each has its own virtue, and they will delight in the fact." Also in the Ethics, he writes, "The friendship of man and wife, again, is the same that is found in an aristocracy. For it is in accord with virtue. The better gets more of what is good." I have argued elsewhere that the notion of female inferiority in the thought of Aristotle rests primarily in his antiquated biology and secondarily in his experience of the limited activities of women. Nevertheless, in his own words, he identifies that a friendship of virtue can exist between husband and wife. They are rendered equal and achieve virtue, perhaps precisely because of their differences. Now, Aquinas is known for many things, but especially for introducing Aristotle to Christian environs. Typically, Aquinas would be what we would call a solid Aristotelian, someone who follows Aristotle's thought carefully. Nevertheless, despite the misinformed reputation that he has as a misogynist, he parts from Aristotle's teaching that woman is mas occasionata at least 5 times, insisting that even if woman was mas occasionata on a biological level, keep in mind he's working with the same antiquated biology that Aristotle had, not much had progressed in the sciences, she was most certainly intended by God and not malformed in any way. In fact, in one instance of addressing the question, he puts Aristotle in the role of the objector, someone whose view he is contesting. In the Summa Theologiae, prima pars, question 93, Article 4, Aquinas explicitly states that the imago Dei, the image of God, is found equally in woman and man, and that this is reflected in their intellectual nature. In other texts, he clearly maintains that woman was not created simply for the purposes of reproduction. Rather, she shares the same end as man, ultimately to know God. Earlier in question 92, Article 3, Aquinas addresses the question of whether it was fitting that woman should be created from the side of man. Relying on an old Jewish proverb, he first answers that it was not fitting that she should be created from the head of man to rule over him, nor from his foot to be ruled by him, but from his side to rule with him. Aquinas maintains that woman has a role united with that of man, socialis conjunctio, a social union of sorts. To strengthen this image, he proposes that woman was created from the side of man, as the church was created from the side of Christ crucified, in the blood and water which poured forth upon the piercing of his side. The equality, taken together with the differences of woman and man, serve as a basis for their complementarity and an understanding of woman that was probably a bit countercultural in Aquinas' time. In fact, such is still the case in many parts of the world, including the developed nations. Previously, I've argued that Aquinas does not tie women to social norms or other constraints. In fact, I think that his consideration can be used to free the concept of women from cultural prejudice, recognizing her equal to man in humanity while respecting the differences as qualities and not defects. This reading of Aquinas as arguing fundamentally for the equality of women is underscored in his treatment of marriage in the Summa Contra Gentiles, where he discusses whether marriage ought to be monogamous. I find this rather timely in light of our recent headlines about thruples and polyamory, but he develops the idea that between husband and wife there should exist a friendship, and that friendship requires a type of equality. If there is more than one wife or more than one husband, there could not exist a friendship of free individuals. In fact, it would be more of a servile relationship. He points to the example of men who have many wives. They end up treating them as one might treat a servant, rather than treating them as an equal or equals. Of course, this is not particular to polygamy. It can be a defect in monogamous marriages too. But the multiplicity of partners means that there cannot be the close, intimate friendship of equals. Here he returns to the thought of Aristotle's idea of friendship in marriage. Aquinas goes on to argue against marriages involving incest. Again, there would be a fundamental inequality which would render the close friendship, especially one of virtue, impossible. At this point in this brief overview, I would like to interject Ephesians 5:21 through 33, perhaps one of the most controversial biblical texts on women. Unfortunately, the modern ear fixates on Ephesians 5:22, some version of wives be submissive or subordinate to your husbands. In other words, in other works, again with the help of Aquinas, I have offered that this is not a servile type of submission, where one gives up one's will as a slave is required to do. Rather, it is an economic submission, one which respects the rights and dignity of all the parties involved. We freely, even willingly, engage in such submissions every day. Read carefully, St. Paul puts the onus on husbands, I would argue, more than on wives, even though he starts out, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. In some ways, I wonder if this passage isn't a correction of Genesis 3. Nowhere does Paul tell wives to love their husbands. But he repeatedly tells husbands to love their wives, and that they should love their wives as Christ loved the church, laying down his life for her. Wives instead are admonished to be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. Obviously, one can argue that love is implied, but it is not explicit. Further, the text is clear that this is in the context of the husband rising to the example of our Lord. In other words, no woman is expected to be subjected to an abusive husband simply because he is a man. The spousal relationship between Christ and the church shows us what marriage should be like. Nevertheless, as humans, we only live that type of self-gift, union, and intimacy in an analogous manner. Christ and the church live it perfectly. Further, in the discourse of the Last Supper, Jesus tells his disciples, "This is my commandment, love one another as I love you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you." I don't think it's a stretch to say that in marriage, where the husband is called to lay down his life for his wife as Christ did, there should exist a deep friendship as exists between each soul and Christ, and between Christ and the church. Augustine calls original sin the felix culpa, the happy fault, because through the incarnation, we have the potential to be restored to a state higher than that experienced by Adam and Eve before the fall. We are invited to become not only sons and daughters of God, but friends of God. If I recall correctly, Aquinas notes that in this capacity, humans are greater than the angels, even though angels are higher in the order of being. While the church is dependent on Christ for her existence, Christ has raised humanity in the church to the level of his equal. This raising also involves very much the movement of Christ. He becomes man, one of us, in order to go beyond restoring us to humanity's original state before the fall. Indeed, his love is a radical love, but only possible in the context of a radical equality, where he becomes like us so that we may become like him. You may recall Proverbs 27, iron sharpens iron, friend shapes friend. Ronald Knox, biblical scholar, preacher, and author, in one of his reflections on the Eucharist, observes that we tend to think that God instituted the Eucharist with bread and wine because they reminded him of, our Lord, because they reminded him of the grace that comes from the Eucharist. However, Knox offers that it's the opposite order. Instead, God gave us bread and wine so that we would eventually understand the Eucharist. Knox writes, "He did not design the sacred host to be something like bread. He designed bread to be something like the sacred host." If I may borrow from this, I would offer that the deep friendship that can exist between husband and wife should in fact exist because our experience of marriage informs our understanding of the spousal relationship between Christ and his church. Put another way, Aquinas taught that grace builds upon nature. If we do not understand something on the natural level, it makes it far more difficult for us to understand it in the supernatural. So while the differences between women and men may seem even insurmountable at times, I think we're required to step back in order to have perspective so that we can understand that the differences are not the problem. They are part of God's ordained solution to the problem of sin. In fact, the economy of salvation relies upon the created differences in creation. So perhaps the tendency towards sameness is something we should consider avoiding in some cases, exercising instead our differences so as to experience radical equality and radical love. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 12 minutes for questions, and I think because of the size of the room and the number of people, it would really be most helpful if you could ask the questions from the mic so that everyone can hear, if that's possible. And you may direct them to the panel as a whole or to individual panelists. Anyone?
I'm Father
Yes.
Bob Gall from Rome, Santa Croce. I'm sorry that I missed part of the session, but I have a question for Pia, which there are a lot of fascinating considerations in your presentation. Thank you very much. You really propose difference, and in a cultural context in which many people emphasize sameness. what you laid out, there seems to be a lot of considerations regarding the exclusively male priesthood. I wonder if you could comment.
Okay, by way of background, Father Bob was the director of my dissertation, so he likes to provoke. And in the first draft of my dissertation that I sent to him, in the middle of it, he was using track changes. He wrote, "This is really boring." And I think I still have that file. I think that because when we're talking about priestly ordination, it's precisely because of that the spousal relationship between Christ and the church. The priest stands in persona Christi to the church, as bridegroom to the church. And women, we personify the church. And in fact, Ratzinger, in his document on the collaboration of men and women in the church, 2004, before he was Pope Benedict, said that this is the vocation of women, to show what it means to be bride, how to live the church. So the difference is, it comes down to that understanding of the nuptial relationship. And I think if we don't understand that, then we get stuck in these ideas. So everybody's familiar, I think, with all the various gender theories that are out there. And I find that most of those theories are actually far more rigid than what the church proposes. The church proposes that we are identified on the basis of our biological sex. But then the church doesn't say, well, women can only do this and men can only do that. And for the church, it comes down to that spousal relationship or the nuptial relationship. And if you look at the lives of the saints, they all lived these very different lives. Some of them didn't even like each other. In the session I was in previously, we heard about how Augustine and Jerome went at it back and forth, right?
Yeah.
So the fluidity, to my mind, is within our understanding of how we can live out that spousal relationship, which at the end of the day is going to manifest itself either in maternity or paternity, either biological level, psychological, spiritual. And again, there's that wonderful freedom that we have in the church, that people live this out according to the gifts that they have been given.
Thank you. Yeah. Professor.
Michael Waldstein, my name, Franciscan University. Question for Scott, great Scott. Wonderful talk. I was particularly intrigued by what you said about the building of the intimate community between husband and wife being fruitful for the kingdom. And one thing that occurred to me is that in Homer, as in all Greek culture, hospitality is a fundamental thing. Not into the bridal chamber. It's an intimate space. In the scene that you talked about, Odysseus made well-fitting doors. But there's a close relationship between that space and the rest of the house for the hospitality in the first place to children. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, thank you for the question. And I should add, by way of background, that Dr. Waldstein was one of my earliest and most formative professors.
This entire thing is like rigged. This entire audience. I feel very taken advantage of here. Okay.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. This is something that has struck me in multiple readings of the Odyssey, that there's a homecoming on two levels. And the first one, I think, as Odysseus is journeying home, he has these various encounters that are meant to forge a kind of character that prepares him for that homecoming in order to be a husband and a ruler within the kingdom. And so this underscores that the intimate union of spouses does extend outwards through hospitality, through the rearing of children, all the way to, in the case of the Odyssey, Odysseus is being prepared and stably rooted or located in his household in order to restore order to the kingdom. And because the epic doesn't end, that is, we don't see that restoration really until maybe the very, very last moment of the epic, what we see is the disorder that is brought about through the collapse of the household. And so this is one of Homer's way of showing inversely that where the household begins to fall apart, it has these ramifications both within the household with respect to hospitality and with respect to political rule within the kingdom. So there is a wonderful interconnection and a kind of widening of the scope of virtue from the individual to domestic society to political society. And this all comes out, I think, beautifully in the Odyssey.
Very good, thank you. And Dr. Deavel, I'd like to ask you a question. I was reading an article recently about marriage rates dropping and cohabitation increasing. And one of the points the author had to make was that marriage is no longer something that young men in particular aspire to. Whereas if you even 20 years ago talked to a young man just graduated from college, you would often hear him say, I want to get married and have a family and live in a community, that sort of thing. Whereas that kind of marriage is no longer seen as something to a goal that is desirable for a lot of young men. And I think part of that probably does have to do with the availability of contraception and pornography and that sort of thing. But yet at the same time, we're seeing Jane Austen's novels have a kind of enduring popularity and for their romance and their ideas, their high ideas. And I just wonder if you have any thought on how classics like this might help to bring about sort of a new relevance for marriage, particularly among younger people.
Okay, so maybe two things. I think they're more popular among women than men, which may not be particularly useful for the answer. But I do think that Austen does some things very right. So if you were to be in the Romantic period, Lydia would be the heroine of the novel, right? Because she throws off all expectations of herself and she throws herself into a marriage for love. And then it turns out maybe not even a marriage for love, right? But what's interesting about Pride and Prejudice, and then I was just reading Persuasion over the summer, which I very much recommend to you, is this notion of having so much that needs to be done to be prepared for marriage, which is interesting. I think that when I talk to students, often there's so much time that we spend trying to figure out what are you going to do, right? What are you doing to prepare yourself for work? Except that, of course, if it's true that ruling the kingdom is your work, but you can't do that properly unless you're living well as a human being, for most of us, living well as a human being is to be part of a family. Not for all of us, but for many of us. It looks as though then, if we're not spending time talking about what that looks like, we put the cart before the horse. One of the things I like about Pride and Prejudice, and I do think it's interesting because it does sort of go against our tendencies. So for a contemporary, I touched on it briefly, but Charlotte thinks that once she stops disliking Darcy, all the things about him will just rule the day. Once she stops thinking that he's a conceited idiot, right, then the fact that he's rich and handsome and that he does have good character is enough to just seal it. But here the notion is that affection can be granted far too easily, which is what happens in the case of Wickham. But here, Austen is very clear that Elizabeth is trying to figure out whether the basis of esteem is going to blossom into affection. Even when she thinks she's lost Darcy, the phrase is, never had she thought that she could have loved him more than now when love was out of the question. It's not clear that she loves him yet. So part of it is, I think, making a pretty clear distinction between affection or being smitten by someone and love as based on esteem and character. But in order to be in a friendship of character, you have to actually have it, right? Which sets the bar quite a bit higher. But if you can set the bar higher, it's so clearly the better good, right? That last speech, what it means to be accepted by a woman worthy of being pleased. What does it mean to please a woman who's worthy of pleasing? That is something worth aspiring to. So in some sense, I think we made certain things about marriage, like the affection part, we don't understand what that means. That part's pretty easy because it's not tied to the things that are hard. But once you start talking about the things that are hard, they're so clearly worth working for. So I think the novels can help us there.
Okay, thank you. I think we can take one more question. Oh, all right. Okay. I'll do two.
Good. So in case you didn't know, I'm obviously not a dissertation professor for anyone.
Okay, thank you.
So this isn't rigged.
Are you one of her kids or something?
No. But I was curious relating to McIntyre's talk yesterday, and I make no claim to understand any and everything of what he said, so you can correct me if the premise of this question isn't correct. But from what I garnered yesterday, he was saying that friendships become more pure the more that they lack the incidental friendships, the more that they lack the incidentals of utilitarianism and the other one. So I was curious when that enters, and perhaps Dr. Hefelfinger, this is directed more at you, in a marriage, and there's such a vast array of them, but when can that heightened friendship enter in? Because obviously to some extent, there is the pleasure in the utilitarianism throughout most, if not all, of marriage for most people. So when is it possible for there to be an elevated purity of friendship, in marriage at some point, even in courtship? When would you say that begins? Would you have any ideas of what distinctions there would be to elevate that from not the purity, not the pure friendship that Professor McIntyre was speaking about yesterday?
Thanks. That's a great, simple question. So I also make no claims to understand all the ins and outs of Professor McIntyre's talk, and I actually didn't pick up on exactly that point. The way, though, that I think Aristotle would see this is a virtuous friendship. I'm not sure I would use the word purity. It is noble, it is higher. But one reason, just to give an example, since I know we're running out of time, one reason that it doesn't lose the aspect of the pleasant as it grows in virtue is because, first of all, in marriage, we shouldn't think of the pleasure specifically related to sexual pleasure. It is delighting in the spouse, delighting in the virtues of the spouse. So as you grow in that virtuous dimension, we would think and hope that we're going to be growing in that delight and that appreciation of the virtues in each other. So I would, and utility is a slightly different category in Aristotle's mind. He kind of lumps it in with the pleasant being in some way superior because it's desired for its own sake, whereas utility is just a means. So I think these are some of the ways to begin to tease that out. And practically speaking, I think some of this delight, some of this delight and the growth in virtue, it starts very early on, I would think, in a courtship, and that can be, although not necessarily at the very beginning, that can be a really helpful and lovely part of growing to know somebody. You delight even in platonic friendships, right? So it seems fitting that you would delight in a friendship that begins in a romantic way and maybe culminates in giving oneself fully to the other.
If I could just jump in very quickly, I think Thomas describes love as willing the good of the other. So in courtship, for example, first of all, courtship, it should be fun. You're getting to meet people. It should be an excellent time. But when you're dating someone, if you're honest about it yourself, you can realize that you may not be the right person for them, or they may not be the right person for you. That, to me, is an example of love, of a higher love. Or when religious or clerical vocations enter into the equation, and no one denies that the two people love each other, right? But you understand that that one of those people is being called to a different vocation, a different spousal or nuptial vocation. And I think in that case, you would practice that type of love by allowing that and even encouraging it and supporting it. And in marriage, there are lots of things, from the mundane to very serious things, where in order to put the good of the other ahead of your own good, and I don't mean like in a psychotic, codependent, sick clinical way, all right? But it's going to that to my mind is the higher level of friendship, when you put the other's good ahead of your own and you're willing to sacrifice. And again, that's what we see on the crucifix.
Apparently, let me just say, your question, I think, let's put in a distinction. Everyone is to be loved because this person is in the image and likeness of God. You're not going to marry someone because that person is in the image and likeness of God. don't do that, right? So there are two things we're asking. So one is, what is the source of dignity? And that's it. And everyone is to be loved on that level. If you're looking to get married, you're looking for excellences in the other person that are worthy of your respect, and excellences that can push both of you toward holiness. So let's be really clear what we're doing here. Everyone is to be loved. Not everyone would make a good spouse for you, whether or not this person is to be esteemed. But you're not looking for a minimum in courtship, right? You're looking for something that's going to push you toward heaven, and someone whom you think you can push toward heaven. So I think there's a distinction between what you ask what's lovable about the other person, you get what's lovable about them as a human being per se, versus the excellences, the virtues, and we need to keep those distinct.
All right, and then this will be our last question, if we could do quickly.
If anybody needs to leave, I understand.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This was like a breath of fresh air. I'm a stay-at-home mom with 3 little ones, so this was just amazing.
Yeah.
And Pride and Prejudice was in it. It was even better. So my question is to take both of your points, but then applying them to Pride and Prejudice, the idea of having 2 partners that are equal, and even at a distance, we can see that they are clearly equal, like Odysseus and Penelope. And you have, but obviously very clear differences. The married couple that I think is most different in Pride and Prejudice is Mr. Collins and Charlotte. I think it's very interesting in that you point out he does think that they are equal. In a way, is it because she has submitted herself lower than him? And is that a noble thing that she has done to so convince him that they are equals because of her willing submission? Does that make her more noble, or is that somehow cast light on Elizabeth requiring somebody she can actually submit to? Like, which one's more noble?
Okay, here's the 30-second version. Okay. Because she's chosen a marriage for prudential purposes, she needs to be a good spouse within that marriage, right? Once you've said yes, you've committed yourself to this marriage and this man. Whether you should have done that is another question at this point, and that question is past. But it's interesting to me that Mary the forgotten sister, right? Mary actually has an appearance in the Mr. Collins debacle at the Bennet home. And we're told that Mary recognizes herself to be more intelligent and a better understanding than Mr. Collins, and she thinks that were they to marry, she could improve him, right, through her efforts. This is then cast as a contrast when Elizabeth is recognizing with pain that her father has not applied himself, right? She says, if he had applied his talents, which are rather great, he could at least have made his daughters respectable, even if he couldn't have improved the mind of his wife, right? So part of what's going on, we keep talking about growing in virtue. What does that mean? It sounds very abstract. But part of it is the little things like actually talking about what Mr. Collins is reading. He's happy to pontificate, and so is Mary. But they can actually have a conversation about that. So I think your question is an interesting one, because Charlotte has decided that he's just unhelpable in various ways. But that sounds a lot like Mr. Bennet. Even if he's not at her level, she could still attempt to improve. Now, back to Pia's point, don't take on a fixer-upper. That is not really what's being said here. But do you want to improve your spouse? And the answer should be yes, but that has to be fraternal correction. So I think there is an ability to Mrs. Collins not doing what Mr. Bennet has done. Mr. Bennet has exposed his wife to the children's contempt, that is the word, which completely disorders the household. Right? And Mrs. Collins, one hopes, will not do that. And at least that part is noble on her part.
Okay. All right, and we're going to unfortunately have to end it there. Thank you so much.